What's up guys, this is Weasel for PokerWeasel.com. Welcome to this brand new series. It's called Season of Storms. It's a type of hand history review. It's based on a concept which I picked up from one of my favorite coaches. The idea is, rather than just running hand history reviews on specific hands, we're going to have a look at every single hand that was played in a session. There's going to be a filter on the hand, so we're not going to have a look at every single hand. We can have a look at every hand which is 20 big blinds or larger to make it a bit more realistic. That means we're going to try and get through a large number of hands in one session. I plan on doing a few of these with different students. This is my first student. We're going to call him Mr. J to protect his identity. You can see that the stakes have been cut out, the screen names have been cut out. I will give you a clue though, this is a micro stakes limit, so it's going to be some low limit online poker played at one of the bigger traffic networks. So this first student, we'll call him Mr. J. Other students to come, and these are guys who are actively taking coaching with me at the moment, and this is an extra way for them to get a boost to their game. Alright, so let's get started. This particular player was having some issues in terms of he was doing pretty well, but then things started going the wrong way. We're not really sure if it's mindset issues yet. I suspect there might be some problems going on in big pots. Don't know at this stage. Let's have a look and see what's going on. Okay, first hand we have 5-4 of hearts. We've got a HUD here, but it's a pretty large player pool Hero is playing on. You probably know which room I'm talking about already. So we don't have stats on everyone. Calling here is certainly fine in an overcall situation. This should just be a check fold on the flop, and that's exactly what Hero does. So let's move to the next hand. That's fine. King 10, this should be a 3-bet pre-flop according to my pre-flop ranges. Villain calls. Question is, do we c-bet this flop texture? I think this can go either way. Generally speaking, the 10x on a Jack 10 5 two-tone is somewhat vulnerable, benefits from protection. However, holding the king counteracts that somewhat because some of the turn cards actually improve us to a draw. We can have things like a queen rolling off, an ace rolling off. These cards obviously improve our hand to a draw, either a gut shot or a straight draw. Of course, we can hit the king. The king would ordinarily be a worrying card on this particular flop texture, but it obviously gives us 2 pair in this case. I think probably betting's still going to be slightly the best play. Actually, villain donk bets. How should we play in this situation? Probably fine to fold straight away, just based on population tendencies. Most guys do not donk bet into 3-bet pots without a decent holding. It's very rare this is going to be a bluff. So although in theory this should probably be a call, if you're playing low limit games online, might as well just go ahead and fold the flop. Situation's not really going to improve at all on the later streets. We could of course pick up some of the aforementioned draws, pick up a king, but we're still always going to be worrying. Even if we pick up a king, maybe villain just has pocket 5s all day. So I think we could have saved ourselves 10 big blinds there on the flop just by Hero folding straight away. King 10. Actually, what's happening? I guess it includes hands where Hero is not involved. So we've just fixed the filter. New format, guys, never tried this before, so the filter should be a bit better now. Only includes spots where Hero is involved in the hand. Okay, pocket 10s in the cutoff, we open raise, and we face a 3-bet. We have 63 hands on this guy. Seems relatively aggressive with 3-bets over the very small sample. Seems like a reg, actually, 25-18 so far. Probably don't want to be folding 10s here. Don't recommend that we 4-bet. There just isn't really the dynamic to 4-bet 10s here, although actually a small 4-bet would still be reasonable. But we would actually think about falling to a 5-bet, I would imagine. Probably better overall just to call. But not a big deal to make like an 18BB 4-bet and be willing to fall to a 5-bet in this spot. Might sound really sick, but it's okay at micro limits to do that just because players' 5-bet jamming ranges are way too tight and they have a tendency to call too wide against 4-bets. Calling's probably the standard play. Probably okay to peel 1 on the flop, but really not a big deal in terms of... There's not a big difference in expectation between calling and folding, I would imagine. Turn is now going to be a fold at these limits. Villain checks back. Question is, do we want to lead river for value? I would say with pocket 10s, probably not. I think this is just going to be a river check fold, and of course we hope villain checks back. Hero decides to make a very small bet. I think the problem with this is, although there are conceivably worse pairs that may call, for example, perhaps villain ends up having something like king 4 suited, for example, king 5 suited, stuff like that he bluffed with pre-flop. Players also have a tendency to probably c-bet too much on the flop with things like jacks, queens, and kings when they really should be checking. So this is probably thin, given that villain can actually have things like pocket queen still, given that he can play a weak ace this way and decide to check back the turn because he can't get 2 streets of value. Not necessarily saying that's the right play, but this is how opponents may think about the spots. This is probably going to be too thin for my liking. I think it's better just to check If villain bets, we just check fold. So again, another 10 big blinds going missing here. Ace queen of clubs, definitely an ISO raise in the spot. 100 effective, villain calls. Very nice flop. Sizing here is somewhat important if you're playing low limits. We don't want to make a half pot bet. We want to bet something like 7.5 big blinds. We really want to bet big here. This is a terrible bet sizing situation. This really adds up in the long run, by the way. You can demonstrate quite easily with database analysis that the larger bet sizings with very strong hands like this, we're not talking about something that is a weak value hand, something which is very, very strong, probably committed here against a weaker player for 100 big blinds. This is just not the right bet sizing to be using with this hand. May even find out that weaker players have an inelastic calling range here, i.e. they're going to call the same hands whether we make it 460 or we make it even 8 big blinds in this spot. So this is really just not the right sizing here. We'll add up in the long run, will significantly eat into our win rate. Not the best turn card. Having said that, we're still pretty comfortable with our holding here. Best sizing is going to be something like 14.5 big blinds. You really want to make a big sizing. Again, we're just draining value all over the place here. We face the check raise. This is slightly worrying. As mentioned, the king's not the best card. We would still have been committed to fire turn and fire river if villain is compliant in passively calling down. But I think facing this, we seriously have to evaluate whether it's correct to stack off here. I think we're probably right on the cusp. I mean, villain could have all 16 combos of 10 jack right now. Then again, you could also have things like queen king, even things like queen 5, king 5. Ace king seems somewhat unlikely. I think I'd probably have a hard time folding this, so I think probably just going to jam over the top here. I think it's not quite the right fold, but I do think it's very close. I wouldn't consider this a huge leak. Players just don't check raise the turn that wide. I mean, I doubt he's ever bluffing. Question is, could he ever have king 5 offsuit or something, or the suited combos of those hands? 10 jack often is going to amount for a larger proportion of his range, just because obviously king 5 might not include the offsuit combos. So really just looking at 2 suited combos of king 5, 2 of queen 5, if he even has these hands. Ace 5 as well. I'd heavily discount ace king, but that's good for us obviously because we lose to ace king. It's going to be 10 jack a lot. So maybe even correct option is rather than jam, if we felt we were a slight underdog, the best play would to be call turn, call river, because we end up being priced in with pot odds. I think it's probably not a fault for me though, but I don't really have a big problem with this hand. I don't think it's a terrible mistake. 7-9, 3 bets okay from the big blind, could also call. Pretty nice flop. This is one of those flops where, okay, it's okay to start out with a check call line, but I think the hand's good enough where I'm going to be looking to fire both flop and turn, mostly regardless of what the turn card is. Having said that, it's worth noting that villain doesn't have the full stack. So, as a result, it's usually a good idea that our c-betting strategy be slightly more equity driven, i.e. we like the raw equity a little bit more as the stacks get shallower and shallower, because obviously raw equity gets more important as the stack size gets shallower. So this is something now that I might be looking to actually play with a check call line on the flop, and maybe if we're lucky we get some free cards, we can start bluffing on the turn if villain checks back the flop. So 100 big blinds I think are 2-barrel. I think we could potentially run into some difficulty when we're playing against a half stack. There might be better lines here. But I don't think this is a terrible line. I think it's okay. I don't think it's like a big leak or anything like that. Ace Jack. Face a 3-bet here. Now, villain seems to be 3-betting a lot. We don't have any info on his fold to 4-bet yet. Let's just move this HUD out of the way. But he does seem somewhat aggressive, but it's a very small sample, so I don't think calling is going to be quite right at these limits. I think we can 4-bet or we can fold. And when this guy tags along, calling's definitely not going to be right here, just because Ace-Jack does not have the right qualities to play in a 3-way pot post-flop. Ace-Jack suited perhaps, Ace-Jack offsuit, not going to have the right characteristics in the sense that it just doesn't play well multi-way. We're going to flop a dominated ace or a dominated jack. There's no OESDs we can flop. It's just not quite the right hand. However, 4-bet is a very real option here. It's aggressive, but it's an option, because original villain seems to be 3-betting possibly quite aggressively, and the guy who's just cold-called the 3-bet is a fish, so we don't mind necessarily playing a 4-bet pot against the fish. I would just fold here, but I do think 4-bet's an option. It's just a very aggressive option, but it could end up being plus EV. I think Hero makes the right decision there, so that's fine. A7 of diamonds, definitely an overcall spot. These suited aces are very powerful here. If this was three-way, I might consider leading. We have the backdoor nut flush. I think four-way, probably a good idea just to shut everything down. Just not going to get the right amount of folds. Check it round. I think folding's probably going to be the best play here. And that's what hero does. That's fine. 10-9, open from the cuts off. We face a min 3-bet, so we're obviously calling. We don't want to fold against min 3-bets. Villain c-bets. I think just calling here is fine. We have the low end of the straight draw. We have a pair. I don't think raising really achieves that much. We're not really protecting against too much with a raise here. I think calling in, just seeing a turn card is completely fine. I think now on the turn we probably want to raise because the opponent could have some gut shots. He could have some king x, some ace x. Could maybe even have a flush draw. Could have things like queen x, two pair. So I think raising to about 10 big blinds is going to be the best play here. That's what hero does. And we face the re-raise. This is really not ideal. Remember, he did 3-bet pre-flop. So it's possible that he does have things like ace-king in his range. Or things like king-9. Obviously, he's played them in a very strange way because he min 3-bet and he min-bet the flop. But sometimes weaker players do this with strong holdings. Because the reason they do it is, in their mind, they think that they're slow playing. He thinks that his ace-king is so strong that he definitely wants calls all of the time. On the flop, obviously, if he does have ace-king, is a very strong holding. I don't think we can fold this, though. I think best play is to call. And probably call the river. We'll see what the card is. I think 4 big blinds. We just call here. I don't think we necessarily want to raise. I mean, the flush is possible. This guy could easily be doing this with, you know, ace-king, king-9 if he plays it in that small bet sizing range. Having said that, he bets so small, I would still be tempted because we can actually raise fold pretty comfortably here. In fact, my initial reaction was to call, but that's partly because I was expecting to face a bigger sizing. I was expecting we're going to face like a 20 big blind bet on the river, and it's going to be a standard call, but somewhat of a side call because we're really calling to chop against that sizing. But when villain bets 4 big blinds, actually I think we should raise here, and I think we should raise fold because I think he can come over the top if he does have, you know, a flush or king-9 or ace-king. So I think we raise to about 18 big blinds here, and then we fold to a 3-bet. So my initial reaction is just to call. I might change that to raising. You can see he is doing this with ace-king. I haven't seen his hands before, by the way, but I know from experience that's part of his range, even though he's using those very small sizings. 9s with ISO raise, that's fine. Probably would just c-bet this flop. Not because I'm very thrilled with the way 9s is connected with this board, but number 1, because we could easily have the best hand. Number 2, it needs some protection. Number 3, this hand is not going to have very high turn playability after we check back, so better to just c-bet and then give up afterwards, because now facing a bet from our opponent on the turn, if it happens, 9's is not going to play so well. When he checks twice to us, I'd probably still bet, but now I would engineer my sizing so that it's extremely small. I'd probably bet about 250 here, and that's what hero does. And we river the nuts, I guess. We want to bet reasonably large here. It's unlikely villain's strong, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we should bet small. I think that's a point of confusion. We want to give him the option to bluff catch, i.e. we rep a bluff, etc. So I want to bet maybe 1250 here or something. It's okay, it's a bit on the small side, but it's fine. Villain does bluff catch, as you can see. So I think sometimes you can think about these spots in a really erroneous way, where you can think, oh, villain probably is capped at a king x, so therefore I'm going to bet small. Actually, you should just say, okay, I have the best hand nearly always. I should therefore use a large river sizing and give my opponent the opportunity to bluff catch. And, you know, we're trying to rep something that has busted, etc., like a busted gut shot. We're trying to fold him off his capped range. So usually the larger sizings make more sense. Even if you do get slightly more folds with a larger sizing, that doesn't necessarily mean it's less profitable. 9s, open raise, face a 3-bet from big blinds. Calling's fine here. I mean, so is raising. I think calling's probably the standard thing to do. And it's unlikely we're folding this hand at any point. Villain checks. We are still committed at this point, by the way. Obviously, he could have queen 10, but he'd probably be firing the turn with that. So a bet here is fine. And I think this is a pretty straightforward shove. Like, I'm really not that worried about being beat here. It could happen from time to time, but most of the combos that beat us by the river are going to be firing the turn. You know, we're talking about things like king jack, king 9. Debatable whether he has these in his range anyway. You know, kings, that's one combo now on this river card. Jacks he's probably firing the turn with. On the other hand, maybe he 3-bets something like ace-king pre-flop or something like king-queen, and he decides he's going to go into check call mode when he picks up the king. And he's probably not folding trip kings against a river shove, so I think pretty straightforward shove. Good for him if he has his beat somehow. Queen jack, we open raise, big blind calls. Probably should c-bet on this flop. In theory, it makes an okay check back, the way that lower limit games play. However, probably better to c-bet the majority of the time and fire most turns. Sizing here again is very important. We've picked up a card which basically turns a hand into a monster against villain's range, especially given that he might raise stuff like 4s and 2s. Correct sizing is going to be a large one here. We want to see minimum sizing 650. This is not going to cut it, unfortunately. So Hero definitely has an issue with his bet sizings when he has a value hand. He's just not extracting maximum value. We face check raise, which is somewhat strange. I think I would probably call here. I'm not happy about this at all. This is a really tough spot. I think probably we have to call, but the expectation is going to be very marginal. I think one of the reasons why we have to call is when we look at villain's pre-flop play, he's calling a min raise. You know, he can actually have things like jack 4, jack deuce, and overplay them. You can also have things like queen 4, queen deuce, because he's defending against a min raise pre-flop. And he may decide these hands are strong enough to raise on the turn. Now, a lot of the time it will be pocket 4s, pocket 2s. There are some straights that get there on the river, although I'm not overly worried about straight. Most guys are not competent enough to check raise something like 8-9 here, for example, against a double barrel. Players just don't really do that. Even king 10, not worried about, although, of course, king 10 doesn't even improve to beat us on the river anyway. And generally, the way we should approach these river situations is we're not thrilled about facing this bet sizing here. There are ways we can be beat. But because there are worse value hands that our opponent could be betting for value, then it's nearly always going to be a call. By the way, I think when you start looking at the theory side of things, it's just a very, very easy call. So you might wonder, why are we talking about this? It's just the way that micro-limit games work, is that players just don't bluff anywhere near enough. So if you ever find yourself in a situation with a pure bluff catcher here, you nearly always have to fold because you're just not getting the right odds to call, given that opponent's never bluffing. The thing that can help bridge that gap between how often we need to be good and how often we are actually good is the fact that we might have a hand where our opponent could be value betting some worse hands. In other words, we don't have a pure bluff catcher. And I think looking at queen jack here, it's not a pure bluff catcher. We still beat some 2-pair type stuff. We should be calling here in this spot. And villain was check raise bluffing. It's not something I expect to see with a high frequency. He was firing the river as a bluff, but that's good for us. We're not saying villain has 0 bluffing frequency. We're just saying he's bluffing less than he should be. He does have a bluff this time. Ace king, open raise. Fine to just play bet, bet, bet here, depending on the run out. Again, the sizings, don't like them. I mean, we've got a jewelry texture. Ace king must be able to boost this sizing. This is like 60% pot. We should be betting like 4 big blinds here. This is not good bet sizing. Probably the same on the turn. I'm not especially worried about 6-4 or 9-6, although they are possible in a blind versus blind scenario. In fact, notice we're short here, so we can't really fold this hand. It's really just about getting as much money in as quickly as possible, I think. With this particular SPR on the turn, I'm guessing we should be betting around about 8 big blinds here. That will set up an okay sizing for the river. Not 5.4. This is terrible. Just ship over the top here because of the the stack depth. We can't fold ace king here. Oh my goodness, that's insane. Don't do this ever, guys, please. 30 big blinds. Top pair, top kicker on a coordinated texture. Please never ever fold this at any point ever. This is just very, very ridiculous. I don't know if Hero maybe just didn't see the stack depth here. Like, this could be more of a decision if we're facing someone who has chips behind. But the amount of chips someone has behind is actually very, very relevant. It's not just a case of looking at our pot odds and our equity and saying how often are we good here. It's very much, especially when you start playing, big bet poker, such as No Limit Hold'em, it's very much about how much someone has left behind in their stack as well. And the more chips villain has behind in his stack here, the worse of a situation this is for us. Villain's shallow here, this is not a bad situation at all. Okay, I mean, we might prefer not to get raised, but this is still a very, very easy re-raise here for value. So this is a very bad fold. Aces. Make a huge 3-bet. That's fine, by the way. I like these large 3-bets as an exploit. Actually, it's a squeeze, isn't it? So it's not that large. Pretty standard squeeze sizing, in fact. Both guys cool. It's one of the reasons why I like large sizings, by the way. If you wanted to make it 15 here, then whatever. it's much better to be in a 15 big blind heads up pot than it is to be in a 39 big blind three-way pot. So this complicates things slightly being three-way. I think the guy to our left is obviously short stacked with 32.6 BB, so we're not folding aces against him ever. Having said that, we don't want to overextend ourselves in the flop texture in terms of bet sizing, because we are still playing full stacked against the player in the small blind. So the idea here is make a relatively normal c-bet sizing. If the 32 big blind guy jams on us, we call it off. If the other guy raises, then we have a decision on our hands. Now, given that this is a very bloated pot, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a squeezed pot, and number two, we have two callers instead of one caller. We're in a very, very large pot right now, because there's 39 BBs in the middle, and if you think about the average size of a 3-bet pot, it's perhaps going to be 18 BB, so it's over twice the size of a standard 3-bet pot. And compared to some of the smaller 3-bet pots, you might find yourself in a 3-bet pot which is just 14 BBs, and this one's 39 BBs. In fact, if you think about a very small 4-bet pot, let's say the action goes, someone min raises, 8 big blind 3-bet, and then a 4-bet to 16 BB, you could have a 4-bet pot which is 32 BB, and here we are in a squeezed pot which is 39 BB. So this is what we mean by bloated. Now, generally speaking, if you're in a bloated pot, the sizing you should use should be quite small. We know, for example, that if you're in a 4-bet pot, you should be betting 1/3 pot as your standard c-bet size. Well, this is not a 4-bet pot, but the size of the pot is bigger than the average 4-bet pot. That should tell us our sizing should be quite small here. So we definitely don't want to come out with like a 30 big blind bet here. That's not going to be quite right. Probably want to bet something like 15 BB here. Should be completely fine. So less than half pot. So this is pretty large situationally. I don't think Hero's really thought about this. Having said that, I think this is an excellent turn card for us, and I think given that we have set ourselves up with this SPR of 1, so perhaps it's not that bad actually, the sizing, because this is a pretty favorable situation for us. It's not that likely that villain is going to slow play queens, nines, twos. On the other hand, he could have in his range flush draws, straight draws. He can have queen X holdings. So this is a very favorable situation for us. We just jam here. Definitely jam, by the way. The SPR is less than 1, so we don't want to see any small bet sizings. This is the correct option. He folds. Okay, that's fine. Okay, ace-queen. This is very similar to the ace-jack we played earlier. This is really kind of a 4-bet or fold spot for me. You don't really want to be calling here. You can call ace-queen suited, but ace-queen offsuit, you want to fold this pre-flop. That's what Hero does. So, nice hand. Fours. Mostly just bet, bet, bet. Villain raises. This is an interesting spot. While I think re-raising, getting the stacks in is okay, my preferred play here is actually just to call, despite the fact that we're on a drawy texture. And, firstly, this guy's looking quite tight so far. Secondly, he could potentially have 6s and 8s. In fact, he may not raise without these holdings. So it's a spot where it's difficult to say how much of an equity advantage we have against villain's range. And even if we are doing pretty well against his range, by the time we re-raise against a tight player, then we might not be doing so well anymore in terms of equity. So there are situations like this where obviously we'd love to protect our pocket fours in this spot, but that doesn't always mean that re-raising is the best option. We have to consider our equity as well. So normally best thing is just to call here and see what situation evolves on the later streets. Here he does 3-bet, villain folds. It's not the worst play in the world. It's not my preferred option, but again, it's hard for it to be a big leak at these limits. You probably will be reasonably good when you get the money in still. Ace-king. Bet. This is a pretty bad turn card. I don't mind taking either a hybrid approach where we just make an underbet here on the turn, bet 5 big blinds, so we're still value betting, but we're understanding that it's a bit tougher to get called by worse on this run out, and there's a greater chance the villain has us beat, so we reduce our bet sizing as a result. Or we simply turn our hand into a check call, because some of the best hands to bet flop and check call turn with are those which have a bluff catcher and a redraw. Now admittedly this bluff catcher is quite strong, but it's not as strong as it looks. On a very dry run out, ace-king is obviously a very good hand. We continue to value bet, but on this texture, king-queen 10-7, ace-king really gets demoted in terms of its relative hand strength, just because there are a whole bunch of straights and 2-pair combos our opponent could have. So it might not be that inaccurate to think of ace-king as being a bluff catcher here, and we clearly have the redraw because any jack gives us a nut gut shot. So excellent hand to put in check calling range. In some senses, if you don't check call hands like this, sometimes you might start to wonder, how is this player defending their turn checks? Do they even bother with that? I mean, again, not the biggest problem at low limits, but I think check calling is probably the best play. I don't think half pot sizing is that great. I don't think it's terrible, I just don't think we're optimizing our win rate here with this play. I like the river small bet. I think that's quite an intelligent bet sizing. And that's one thing this player does do quite well, is that they're willing to explore different bet sizings. And many players at 5-0 are just not willing to do that. You'll just never see them make this 10 big blind bet into a 33 big blind river situation. But it shows that Hero has some awareness of the scenario he's in. You know, he realizes that this is just not a super strong value hand. Yes, it's top pair, top kicker with ace king, but it's clearly not strong enough in this run out to just bomb 3 streets, and Hero's clearly recognized that. Sixes. We actually face a small limp raise here. Should be calling here. The odds are obviously insane. We should be giving up in this flop texture. Interesting turn situation. Yeah, I think it's probably very close to a bet. I think Hero probably made the correct decision to just check fold here. I'm okay with that. Calling's okay here. Overcalling, to be specific. Probably call here. I mean, the board's paired, so we're not thrilled about it, but I don't think we should be folding. Villain checks. Probably a very small protection bet here is good. Given that the hand's less vulnerable when we hold the 2 clubs, optimum sizing is probably 7 big blinds. If you're playing in a tougher environment, you may even opt to check here. This sizing's too large, in my opinion. Best play is now to check back river because we have some showdown value. Okay. Pocket 2s. Just a fold on the flop. Pretty bad hand to have 3-way. Kings, we 3-bet pre-flop. Stack depth is roughly 100. Exactly 100 even. C-bet flop for half pot. That's fine. C-bet turn for just under half pot here. This is more like 25% pot. A little bit small. I do think the hand's still worth a bit more value than this, because now we're in pretty awkward situations. So I think it's a lot easier to bet fold when you make it 18, whereas now a lot of players are going to level themselves in this spot because they're going to start wondering, is he just raising because I bet so small? Then they level themselves, etc. Truth is, this is probably still a fold, and it might seem like it's not a fold because we have the flush draw as well, but it's a heavily dominated flush draw, and that can cause you big problems in these games. So it really now depends on how often our kings are good as to whether we should make the call here. And I would say that they're probably not good very often. We probably are against a flush here or something that's quite strong relative to kings. The only danger that players now have is they start thinking that villain could be quite weak because they bet so small, so they can level themselves into calling. I think Hero made the right decision here. I just want to see a larger bet from Hero. Pocket 2s, we 3-bet against a reasonably loose looking villain who does fold to 3 bets. Check fold flop is usually good. Turn, we need to fire a delayed c-bet here, without question. This sizing's fine. There's probably a couple of different sizings that work here. I think 10 big blinds works fine. I think 6 big blinds works fine. So this is pretty good sizing. River is a check. Super interesting spots. I love these. This is one of the rare situations where I'm probably going to call, if I'm honest. Villain is surely float betting the flop if he has something like 10s or 9s plus, or even an 8x. So what the hell is he value betting right now? This just looks like a bluff, like nearly always with, 2 overs. So one of the rare spots where I'd bluff, I typically advise micro stake students to fold here just because you do need some kind of hand reading ability to make the call here, and it's very, very easy to get this very wrong. And even though I'd call, I still think it's very, very close, but this just looks like it's not a legitimate hand the whole time. Could it be a 5x? I mean, ace 5, does that make sense? So I wouldn't say it's a bad fold. Like I say, if I'm coaching microstake student, I will tell them to fold there by default. It's not really gonna have any meaningful contribution to overall win rate. Now, was this a correct call? It might be because the squeeze sizing's so small and the other guy's probably gonna tag along. I might still fold anyway though. It's not a super attractive spot being OOP against 2 guys. Okay, so we're facing roughly half pot here. so we have to make the call based on implieds, and our pot odds may take a boost if this other guy tags along as well. Hopefully he doesn't raise. He checks. This is very nice. We get 2 cards for our investment on the flop. I think when we pick up a pair, we just give up here, because if you think about opponent's range, he can still have, you know, ace king or something. He just c-bets just because he's been told to c-bet. Realizes he has nothing on the turn, checks back. Probably not going to launch a big bluff on the river. Don't know for certain, but I think there's a reasonable chance it's going to go check-check. We're going to win at showdown against ace king, ace queen, so I wouldn't worry about turning this hand into a bluff or anything like that. Okay, he has tens, that's fine. You know, he's probably not folding that if we bet the river. He looks quite fishy, so 6-5. Again, we have a few options. I like to see some check calls and some check raise mixed in here. I think that's pretty reasonable. I don't think you have to check raise on this texture because it's pretty dry, so you could just not check raise at all. I have a feeling though, if you run analysis, you might find that in terms of exploitative play, it's actually pretty reasonable to do this. Most of the time we should be barreling. The queen is not an especially good card, I think, because it puts some higher straight draws out there, which we may have in our check raising range. In other words, you know, if we check raise something like 10 jack of diamonds on the flop, now that's a much more obvious barrel than something like 5-6. Whereas if we check raise 5-6 and the turn is an ace, we still have the best gut shot in our range. So it's not a great card in that sense. 6-5 is now a weaker draw on a queen compared to the other draws that we may potentially have that we check raise the flop with, assuming we have a check raising range here, which we don't need to by any means. So barreling's okay still, or you could just check fold, whatever really. I think it's probably okay to give up. I'd probably advise most microstake students to give up, and if villain checks back, you could consider launching a big river bluff. I think one of the things that gets mentally quite tricky about these spots is when you fire this kind of hand on the turn, it seems like you really should be following up on the river as well, because you literally have the worst possible hand you could have at this point in time. And, you know, in terms of mental game, sometimes players struggle to be able to pull that third barrel. So because I know that after firing the turn, we should probably fire the river as well, I sometimes advise microstake students, actually just check the turn, check fold. If villain checks back, then you can think about launching a bluff on the river. It's a lot easier to pull the trigger on that bluff, so it puts less mental pressure on lower limit players. Whereas here, really we should be following through on the river. We have the worst hand in our range. We should be firing. Won't be super profitable at low limits. It really doesn't make a big difference whether you fire or not. Villain's probably folding around 40% of the time, so we mostly break even anyway. So not a big deal just to give up, but normally should be firing. That's a very, very loose peel on the flop, by the way. Kind of surprised he's bet calling ace queen. This guy's obviously got some stationary tendencies going on, or perhaps he just doesn't believe us on a 9-deuce-4 when we check raise because, you know, he says stuff like we're either c-betting our sets or check calling, we're never check raising. Not a good line of thought process to have if you're playing micro limits, by the way, but that might be what he's thinking. Jack 7 is a check fold here, but villain checks back, we delayed and fire the river. This is just something very standard that we've worked on with Hero, and you know, this is a very good hand, just didn't work out this time, that's fine. Ace deuce. This is a fold now that it's three-way. This is not quite right. We've talked about raising flops in position with Hero, but this is just not the right situation to do it in because it's three-way, so you've got to give villain more credit, and secondly, he's really, really short, so now what happens if he comes over the top? I mean, can we actually fold a pair of twos now? It's questionable whether we should be, because, you know, he could be jamming gut shots and things. Possibly should even call it off. Again, I don't know if Hero's just not looking at the stack sizes properly, but this is not a good hand. Jack 8, check fold is fine. Delayed c-button turn, follow up on river. Okay, that's good. Doesn't work out again, but it's definitely a good line. Ace king, we call a raise, that's okay. Could also 4-bet. So we face a c-bet. Should we peel is the question. Probably should. We have the ace king high, we have the backdoor nut flush draw. This is a very tight fold, in fact. Not sure why Hero's folding. It was a squeeze pre-flop actually, it wasn't just a 3-bet, it was a squeeze. So his range is going to be a bit stronger by virtue of him squeezing as opposed to just a regular 3-bet, but I don't think this is quite right. I think this is a peel on the flop. I think a little bit too tight of a fold there. I don't think there's a very, very big discrepancy between the expectation of calling and folding there, but it's not quite the right play. Ace deuce, probably a c-bet. This guy is folding slightly too much to c-bets in every spot so far, and we have the backdoors going on here. So we barrel if you pick up a diamond. Should barrel this card as well, by the way. Should bet about half pot. Don't need to bet too big because the board's paired. One of the reasons why we should still barrel this hand is because we still actually even beat stuff like 10 jack and jack 9 as well. We might have some fold equity. So definitely a barrel here. It's good sizing. River we hit, so we're going to value bet. We're going to make it somewhere in the region of 18 to 20 big blinds, and then we're going to fold to a raise. Very good. That hand's fine. That's how you should play that hand. This is a good overcall. Plays very well multi-way. Interesting flop. I think you have options available here. I think leading's okay. I actually think checking might be the best play here, four-way. Should start value betting the turn now. I think half pot should be a good sizing here. This is not a great spot to be in. So according to pot odds, we need to hit 33% of the time to make the call. Obviously we're going to hit 18% of the time with our flush draw. We have some additional outs here, which of course are our 2 9 outs and our 2 8 outs. So that boosts our outs to like 13. We're going to hit about 26% of the time, which is not quite enough according to direct pot odds. Having said that, the other guy might tag along, which could increase our pot odds here in the long run. You know, let's say he tagged along 50% of the time, then 50% of the time the pot's going to be having an extra 24 big blinds in it. So in the long run, we essentially get better pot odds than the ones we're directly offered by our opponent here. Having said that, it's a double-edged sword that other player's behind us, because there's also the possibility that we could be dominated in terms of when he calls, he may have a better flush draw than us. So it's a very close spot overall. I'd say probably you should make the call. I think the expectation is going to be quite low, unfortunately, but probably a call due to implied odds. I think our implied odds are very good on a 9 or an 8, by the way. Although you can't even be certain about that. Maybe villain has ace 9, ace 8, etc. So we've avoided a tough spot there. Probably should have called, but again, it's not really a big deal. Here we open and we fold, that's fine. Jack 7, we call an open raise. We're in the big blinds. Yeah, this is fine. I quite like this. Most players don't do this, but it's something that's quite effective at low limit games, and that's just because the average opponent doesn't 3-bet enough. So you can exploit that by raising much wider than you should be able to get away with. Turn cards somewhat coordinated. The way that this strategy works is the best cards to barrel are the ones that don't complete draws, not the cards that necessarily pick up draws for ourselves. So you don't want to get confused here and think, oh yeah, we picked up a gut shot, let's barrel. It's probably not a very good barrel here, because the kind of hands that are in villain's bet calling range connect with this queen. So it's better to just check back and give up on this hand. Yeah, you can see he's picked up a straight. So this was not a good barrel. This is a misapplication of something that here has been taught. Ace queen. We face a big 4-bet. Honestly, you may as well just fold here. In theory, you should be calling it ace queen combos when facing a 4-bet. When you're playing low limit games, just fold to the 4-bet here. The guy's just going to be far too value heavy compared to what he should have. Kings, we make a 5BB ISO. That's not quite the right sizing actually, is it? Because it should be at least 6BB. And exploitatively you might go even larger. So this is just a sizing which encourages multi-way action. This is not a good ISO raise sizing. And Hero gets punished for that. He's now playing a 4-way pot with kings, which is already a train wreck in my opinion. Best sizing here probably should be slightly smaller, I would imagine. I'd probably follow up with a small bet sizing on the turn, talking like 8 to 10 big blinds, or you can check fold, that's it. Villain checks back. Small value bet on the river, perhaps like 12BB, or again check fold. But I think he can have some one pairs that he pays off a very small bet with. That's not a spot where you can make a big bet, by the way, because it's just too likely that you're beaten by a straight, etc. So you can only make those big bets if you're reasonably confident that you're not beaten with a high frequency. Sixes should be calling the 3-bet here. We decide to check back. It's okay. I don't have any big problems with this hand. I think there's probably some other lines we can take, but it's okay. I mean, turn call's going to be whatever, really, hardly making any money. Okay, so this is the last 20 big blind pot in the first session, so I think we'll call that session after we've reviewed this hand. So we open raise ace 4, we get 2 callers, bottom end of the gutter, so 1 card, low end of the gut shot, so that's not very good, but we do have the back door nut flush, so could see bet if we wanted to. As played, this is probably going to be a check fold down 3-way, and that's exactly what here it does. Okay, alright, so hopefully you enjoyed this new format. We're going to have quite a few of these, and we're going to put it into a big video series, as mentioned, called Season of Storms. Goal is to do a few of these for each hero. So thanks very much for watching, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. This was Weasel for PokerWeasel.com.